everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. So, as we rush to the future, we often, I think, don't really evaluate the path that we're taking. The world changes, technology seems to go ahead and evolve, and people tend to evolve with it, but we're not very intentional about the path that we're on. And so I think it's really important for us to stop and think about the way that we are either embracing or rejecting or developing alongside technology, and whether it's good for us, whether it's something that might even be inevitable and we simply don't have control over parts of it. Thinking about these issues is, of course, the Transhuman editor over at Steve Bannon's War Room. He's an author of the book Dark Aeon, addressing this idea. Joe Allen, thanks for joining me, man.
Auron, very good to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. So let's start from the beginning, I guess. When we talk about transhumanism, I guess that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, not to hit too much on the obvious at the outset. But when we talk about transhumanism, are we just talking about the embrace of, I don't know, wiring a microchip into the human brain? Is this a wider process? Is it only technological, or does it involve the spiritual or the psychological as well? How would you define the transhuman project?
You know, given the range of angles that you just presented, I would say that you've captured most, if not all of them. You know, it begins, I think, at a spiritual level, the conception of what it is to be human, moving into the psychological, the more immediate sort of perception of what it is to be human. And then, of course, technology, how that affects what it is to be human. You know, the term itself was initially coined by Julian Huxley back in the mid-50s, and was really brought to the forefront and kind of simultaneously or independently coined by Max Moore, recoined, you could say, in the early 80s. For Max Moore, the idea is just simply using science and reason to, in essence, enhance the human being. And of course, technology is a large part of that, but the worldview, the scientific worldview, is at the core of it. And so it would be a mistake to say transhumanism is just about chipping the brain or injecting nanobots, but that is definitely an element. And, you know, I try in the book to show how both that narrow definition and the kind of broader way that people think of transhumanism are both applicable, but many people who would never accept the label of transhumanist are indeed transhumanists. That would be anything from, you know, more naturalistic or, you know, even right-wing thinkers, and even a lot of religious thinkers and leaders. The embrace of technology, the use of science to alter the human being, is just part and parcel of the social and technological milieu we're in.
So when do you feel like this shift really takes place? Because, of course, technology has always, to some degree, been a part of the story of humanity. As soon as we start using tools, we start using technique, it starts to shape us. And of course, history is filled with moments where technology shifted the way that our social arrangements existed. Of course, the creation of the longbow and then the crossbow radically reshapes the way that European nobility is able to go ahead and hold their social order together. The Pope recognized this to the point where he tried to ban the crossbow at one point. The technology has always had some role in shaping who we are as human beings, how we interact with the other, how we order our society. But is there a definitive moment where you feel like we move to a transhuman moment, where it's about transcending the ability of the humans, not by just augmenting it with something like a spear or a crossbow, but altering the human themselves in a way that is irreversible or fundamental?
I don't think there's any single point that I have identified. I think it's more just touchstones along the way, or mile markers. You know, arguably, and many make this argument, you know, it began with the transition of humanity out of, you know, a kind of early hominid or Australopithecine state into hunter-gatherers, or maybe the rise of agriculture and the way that shifted everything. or the Industrial Revolution or the scientific revolution that preceded it. I think that maybe a point that is really important is the Second World War and the aftermath of the Second World War. It was in World War II that you had the first computer systems being designed and employed mainly for code encryption. And then in the aftermath of the war, you had people like Norbert Wiener, Alan Turing, Claude Shannon, and they're conceptualizing what computer systems will be, and they're beginning to create the first kind of primitive computers. And even in those early days, the imagination of what all of this would become really laid the foundation for what has occurred in the last 70 years or so. You had artificial intelligence, of course. The term was coined in the mid-50s, around the same time that transhumanism was coined. You had the analysis of Watson and Crick of the helical structure of DNA, and it really opened the doors for what then became the genetic mutations driving everything from just the bacterial engineering to the mRNA vaccines that were forced upon most people on Earth very recently. So I think that post-war period really did mark a point that the acceleration of the process can be apprehended pretty clearly. But then, in the development, I think that the last 5 or arguably 10 years, that the understanding of CRISPR and the development of everything from large language models to maybe the less well-known systems that are accelerating right now. What you've seen in the last 5 years, what I've seen in the last 5 years, convinced me that the predictions of people like Ray Kurzweil, while they're not perfect, you can't look at Ray Kurzweil's prediction and see just one-to-one correspondence with the history that succeeded them. I do think that when I first got turned on to Ray Kurzweil, it seemed fairly imaginative and ridiculous, terrifying if it were to become real, but mainly I just kind of dismissed it as a strange, quirky way of thinking. In the last 5 years, I've really started to change the way I've thought about that. It is not, I don't think our world is going to be flooded by swarms of nanobots that shapeshift and augment our bodies at will, at least not anytime soon. But I do think that the overall vision that he captured and projected onto the world is in fact coming into reality in some form.
Interesting. So I guess I want to address a couple aspects of this because it is so multifaceted. The first one I want to look at, I guess, is the thing that a lot of people are talking about right now, which is the AI component. Whenever I ask this question, I always get a different response, and usually from people I really respect. So I'm always interested in asking it because the fact that so many people who are so thoughtful and experts on this issue have such wildly conflicting ideas about kind of the future AI always makes me, as someone who's not as aware of it or as schooled in it, kind of nervous. That's so few people seem to agree about where this is going. But when it comes to artificial intelligence, where are we in this? As you've said, so much of what we understand, we envision about the future, even a cyberpunk style dystopia comes from science fiction and the predictions, almost the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein understanding of how technology will eventually kind of subordinate our humanity. I talk to some people when we come to AI, and they say, we're so far from AI being anything that we need to worry about that it's laughable. This is just a program that repeats things back to you that you want to hear. That really doesn't matter. I have other people say, well, even if that is the only thing that AI does, that in of itself tends to program the human being for certain responses, and it will short circuit the way that we interact with things because it will go ahead and prompt us for answers without human interactions that we already don't expect. And then there are some people who think AI is like already on its way to ruling us, with an iron fist, Terminator style. When you look at the AI landscape, what do you see out there? What concerns you the most? Where do you think we are on, if this is some kind of timeline towards the overlords here? Where do you think we sit on that?
You know, my personal interest and my academic training is, for the most part, in religious studies, comparative religion, with a healthy dose of scientific instruction on top of that. But without going too far into the weeds on my personal background, I am, in a sense, kind of like a carpenter with, a limited set of tools. And, I'm looking around for nails with my hammer. And so I do look at this by and large as a religious phenomenon, in the sense that religion is the encoding or the encapsulation of worldviews in text, in ritual, in the social norms, in morality. And again, this isn't something that started yesterday or within the lifetime of any person alive now. This is something that goes back certainly to the Renaissance and the rise of science and the scientific method and the Industrial Revolution. But what we are seeing is the fruition of the overhaul of worldviews, the overhaul of social norms, and the world that any human being can expect to encounter outside his door or in the next decade or so. So as a religious phenomenon, and I would argue transhumanists don't like to think of it this way, but transhumanism, posthumanism, it is at the very least a kind of replacement for the content of cognitive modules that religion, traditional religion, once occupied. And, to me, I don't see things in purely naturalistic or scientific terms, but just to kind of begin there, what you see with the rise of artificial intelligence is in many ways maybe Nick Land would say the hyperstition of the golem. And what I mean by that is that, humanity going back 2,500 years at least has dreamt of creating automata that resembled human beings or animals and had a kind of life of their own. And those were, as far as we know, just mere myths. But the fact that those myths were able to apprehend a future that in fact is coming into realization, I think is very important. What we're seeing with artificial intelligence is the realization of the dream of creating a human mind outside of the human brain or outside of the human body, outside of the human experience. I think that the skeptics of artificial intelligence are probably wise to doubt the overwhelming hype coming out of Silicon Valley and Wall Street and the various boosters, the doomsayers, the promoters. All of them on the hype end of the spectrum are always going to be shooting farther than the arrow is able to actually hit, right? But the people that are on the far side of that doubter end of the spectrum, the people who say the artificial intelligence is nothing but a toy, it's just code, garbage in, garbage out, all that sort of stuff. I think that was probably a reasonable stance in the 90s, early 2000s. I think anyone paying attention to the advancement of large language models or the various systems that analyze biological structures, proteins, genetic code, anyone who's seen the advancement in control systems, AI-powered control systems for robotics, the development of humanoid robots or drones or any other technology that kind of fits within that transhuman or futurist milieu, what we're seeing undoubtedly is a rapid acceleration towards something. I don't have any hard predictions about what that actually will be. But and maybe this kind of indicates how limited my point of view is, or maybe I'm dead on target. I'll let the listener decide. But what I do see is this shift in worldview, in social norms, in the kind of boundaries between what is and isn't sacred and profane, that as that accelerates alongside the development of these technologies, in the same way that you don't have to believe that Allah came to Muhammad and dictated the Quran through an angel, and that Allah has, elevates the Kaaba in Mecca to a position of special privilege. You don't have to believe any of that on a metaphysical level to know that Muslims have tremendous social, economic, and military power given their position in the world. And the same could be said of Christianity, Judaism, so on and so forth. you don't have to believe the predictions and the dogmas of any religion to know that religion has tremendous force that can't be denied. And so with the rise of these techno-religions, and it's very heterodox, you could say it's very polytheistic, the rise of these techno-religions are already having an impact through the kind of waves of propaganda, changing the way people perceive what's possible in the future, what's coming in the future, what it means to be human in the future. And so really with just the technologies we have now, the smartphone, digital currency, kind of clunky large language models, drone control systems, surveillance systems, all of these things, non-invasive brain-computer interfaces, just those technologies, if the progress stops right here, as humans become, in my opinion, more and more dumbed down, especially in the West, and as these technologies become more and more sophisticated and able to engage, control, and kind of activate certain aspects of the human mind, the human body, then we're going to see we are already seeing some version of those religious prophecies playing out. And I think that that's really what's to be reckoned with, is that the way in which we approach life is always going to be dictated by worldview, morality, and the kind of day-to-day rituals that our religious conception dictate. And it's happening very, very quickly that the smartphone is far more important than any religious icon or holy text for many, if not most people in the modern world. And the AI represents this sort of disincarnate personality that is able to interact with these people. And it very closely mirrors what an atheist would see in religion, right? Like these supposed non-corporeal beings. But the difference being that it's in your face. It's happening now. It can speak, and it can't be denied that it speaks. You might deny how intelligent it is, and I agree in many ways. You might deny how accurate it is, and that's readily apparent. But how powerful it is, I don't think there's any denying it. It's extremely powerful. It's extremely transformative. And if these systems do continue to become more and more sophisticated to the point that it's kind of impossible to deny their accuracy or their wisdom or authority, so to speak, then anyone who is of a traditional mindset is faced with a real quandary. I think that's a quandary that needs to be taken very seriously.
One of the things that a lot of people use to differentiate the adult mind from the child mind is the idea that the adult can recognize a fictional scenario, right? That the child watches a television show, they believe that part of that's true. They have a problem differentiating it until they get older. And that's why you have to be careful about what you put in a child's television show, because they have a hard time separating those things out. But I think really the next level of development, the point at which you become a real adult, is when you realize that actually the stories are way more true than the material reality that you've been separating them from. And ultimately that's the trick that I think AI is playing on a lot of people, is that they believe that they have the ability to go ahead and separate the truth from the fiction. They have the ability to go ahead and recognize when they're consuming something as entertainment and when it's actually sharing them about something about that's true about the world. But ultimately the stories are the things that are actually sharing what's true about the world. And when you start interacting with an artificial intelligence, even as you say, one that is crude, one that may not be impressive, may not deliver that much original content or understanding or depth or have that much agency, ultimately you're engaging in a artificial reality that will shape your own. You don't actually have the ability, no matter how intelligent you think you are, no matter developed you think you are, you don't have the ability to actually separate those experiences in your mind. You're not really designed to do that. And in fact, the idea that you think you're an intelligent consumer of these things is itself a kind of a lie that allows you to engage even more fully in its own brainwashing. It's like so many people think that, well, because I'm an intelligent and rational person, I can't be tricked by advertising or social media because I am the one in control
Yeah.
of the information. I'm the one shaping these things, not recognizing the way that actually ends up shaping them in spite of that, or actually because of that. The more intelligent of a consumer they become of those products, the more it gains the ability to program them. And I think ultimately that's the danger of AI, is not so much that, it goes ahead and becomes this hyper intelligent Skynet that nukes the world, so much as it becomes able to spit back people's own fantasies about destroying the world to them, until the point where they manifest them in the real world.
The two fictional works or films that I think are the probably kind of paint my vision of the future the most, The Matrix, of course, the kind of techno-gnostic tale, and the film Idiocracy by Mike Judge. And I oftentimes say that my fear is not that the AI will come alive and become this sort of digital demiurge and enslave humanity through its wiles, although there's some element of truth to that mythology. I'm much more worried about kind of walking out my door and literally everyone is idiotic, and the machines are similarly idiotic, but slightly more intelligent than the people, and are dictating behavior. Sort of like if you're at the self-checkout kiosk at Kroger came alive and began walking around and telling you where to put your groceries and where to put your money. Something that is happening right now that I think should probably alarm everyone. I've tried to drive this home as best I can, but it's difficult to do for whatever reason. The rise of e-learning, of digital systems used to educate young people. That's been in the works for a long time. When I taught when I was an instructor in a college, you could see how much it had already invaded, and this was quite a few years ago. But the pandemic, of course, increased the popularity, or at least the use, of e-learning systems. When I was in grad school, you already had the Khan Academy, right, created by Sal Khan. It was a very, very popular way for people to wrap their head around any subject. But of course, all of that's human produced and human managed. What we're seeing now is this push, kind of beginning with people like Sal Khan, who in his prediction of the future, his desire for the future, openly says every student should have an AI tutor. And he's working with OpenAI to incorporate, they've already done so, to incorporate the GPT large language model into the the Khan Academy e-learning systems. And they're deploying them in colleges, universities, and even high schools right now across the country and across the world. And it wouldn't be that big of a deal if it was just kind of isolated to him and his company and his work. But you have Bill Gates, of course, Microsoft, investing in OpenAI, closely connected to all this. He's also pushing the narrative that every child on Earth should have an AI tutor. And of course, Sam Altman, Greg Brockman at OpenAI pushing the same sort of thing. And then you have Elon Musk recently, and going back, he has a history of this, but talking about every child will have a kind of AI Einstein to instruct them. And maybe moving farther right on the political spectrum, people like Mark Andreessen saying exactly the same thing. Now, the content of those systems is going to differ from community to community, and the effectiveness of those systems is going to differ. But what's absolutely happening is the development of a human AI symbiosis, a kind of human machine relationship at a very, very, very young age. And as people were kind of taken by surprise by the rise of the transgender movement, or the rise of what is sometimes called woke, a lot of that began in the universities and then just expanded out from there into the rest of the society. And so while your average boomer might be able to scoff at the idea of every child, which will of course translate into just many or maybe most children becoming human AI symbiotes, and people of our generation are probably more open to the possibility, but still, thinking back to the computer systems of the 90s and the early 2000s, maybe kind of shrug it off. What will undoubtedly occur is that younger generation will see this as normal. It will just simply fade into the background in the same way that the smartphone has. And so some part of their cognition will be externalized, not just in other human thinkers who have written things down so that they can then absorb, analyze, turn it over on their own, but is actively changing the content of what they're learning and shaping that content to their own kind of psychological profile and creating this dependency so that they're basically one dead battery away from being a moron. And I think that this is a really, really important development on top of everything that's happening in biomedicine and, of course, military technology and the way in which AI is being infused into big corporations. If the youngest generation becomes dependent on AI and comes to see AI as a kind of companion, especially as a kind of spiritual companion, then not only have you had a change in the worldview, but you've also had a tremendous shift in what the center, like the highest authority is. And smarter children, I think, more disciplined children, children who's wealthier and kind of already come from families of power and privilege, they're going to fare better most likely. But as you move down the socioeconomic ladder and the ladder of maybe even cognitive ability, what I think you'll see more and more is, in fact, something like that, something between the Matrix and Idiocracy.
You know, as someone who was teaching public high school just a few years ago, this is something that I'm very familiar with. I taught through the pandemic, and you can already see this happening. There was already a real danger in the fact that basically all of the tests that kids had to take had in them had accompanying with them their own computer programs that basically drilled them 24/7 on how to take those tests and how to succeed on them. And so children stopped learning from teachers a long time ago because actually teaching a student is far more difficult than just letting them plug into the computer over and over again and repeat the same process to make sure that they can go ahead and pass the test. Many teachers have, of course, brought this up. Teaching the test is a very old complaint for teachers, but this is something that's been fully embraced at this point by the system, that we want to go ahead and train every student to think the way that the test is given. And that means think the way that the computer applies all of these different systems. And when you get kids into any moment where they have to actually start reasoning for themselves, when they need to start pulling any information for themselves, they're completely unable to do it. Most of them are completely unable to do any form of research. They can't do anything outside of Googling. They think that's the ultimate authority. When they find it, they have no ability to vet the information. The algorithm vets it for them. If it's at the top, it's right. If it's not at the top, they don't bother to look for it. Oftentimes, they're just copying, pasting off the Google summary. They don't even go to the source that it's linking to. And so the idea that they would, go to a library, look at multiple sources, attempt to put something together like that is just entirely foreign. And I'm not just saying that as like the old man who used to ride a brontosaurus to school. I'm saying that as like, we're losing the ability to have any friction in the process. Everything has been centralized into the ability of the algorithm to kind of feed it back to somebody. And so they've lost the ability to do any of that without, that intermediary, that digital intermediary kind of feeding it back to them. And I think you're right that puts you in a real disaster because, the thing that, I just got done writing a book about the total state, but my prediction is that eventually this thing collapses, not because we all gain the will to go ahead and knock it over, but ultimately because the society that we're training is completely unable to upkeep the systems that it's building. And eventually, like you said, if you go ahead and degrade the level of the human capital, you're really just relying on the advancement of the technology to go ahead and paper over that. And if at some point you fall behind that and there's a major failure, well, then no one knows how to fix it because all the people involved in its creation, its actual that have the skill set necessary to kind of reason that into being and go ahead and create it have fallen apart. Do you foresee a moment where the gap between kind of the degradation of human capital and the rise of kind of digital advancement, there's a gap there that allows for this whole system to start coming apart at the seams?
There's a real faith among, say, what you could just loosely call transhumanists or accelerationists, even post-humanists. There's this faith that the system itself, as the technology becomes more sophisticated, as energy becomes easier to produce, whether it be nuclear or more kind of fanciful means, and then also just the efficiency of the systems themselves. Like right now, it requires Walmart-sized data centers to train a large language model. But that process is becoming more and more efficient, and the models are indeed becoming more sophisticated. So there's this faith that the system itself, with human input, will have enough momentum to take off, even, especially among the kind of post-human and accelerationist, effective accelerationist set, that it will have its own kind of life force. Mm-hmm. It won't just be a tool anymore. It will be a new species, or some would say it will be a kind of new spiritual being. I myself, I remain always in the state of constant agnosticism about the future, even about next month, let alone in 10 years. I don't know how much energy they'll be able to extract and put into these systems. I don't know how well they'll be able to sustain these systems. It's quite possible that for the rest of our lives, we're going to be watching this monster grow and grow and grow. And it will be very difficult to tell children who, as they're becoming adults, that this is not what you should put your faith in, that this is a false god. I think I'm not saying that is going to happen. I'm not even going to say that's the most likely outcome. But I do think that it's a possibility that needs to at least be accounted for and taken seriously, just as the collapse of the system needs to be taken seriously. Some societies, it's probably kind of inevitable that you're going to see a series of growth and collapse, right? Third world countries all across Africa and the poorer areas of South Asia. I think that it's much more likely that you'll see the rise and fall of different kind of, technotronic, futuristic societies that then, they're not able to turn the gears fast enough. They're not able to, respond to cyber attacks or just failures fast enough. And you see that kind of that rise and fall pattern. But in America, in China, in Russia, smaller but very powerful nations like Israel, across Europe, I think that there's every reason to think that not only because of the a vast amount of capital poured into these systems, and so therefore an incentive to make them work, even if they're not really working all that well. Of course, the large amount of human capital in these systems, just very intelligent people that are being incentivized to constantly maintain them. And then more and more a propagandized society that is becoming very faithful that these systems are going to produce better and better health outcomes, better and better economic outcomes, and of course, position these different countries for greater and greater geopolitical dominance through military technology and other means. I think that there's, again, in advanced nations, there's every reason to think that for most of the rest of our lives, or for the rest of our lives, assuming we live out into our old age, but this is going to be a constant presence. And so the question is going to, if that's the case, the question is, do I submit to this system? Do I find some compromise with the system, with this new kind of techno-religious civilization? Do we find ways to overcome it and dominate it so that it's now like a techno-traditionalist system? Or do people find ways to kind of isolate themselves, to pull back, to retreat and regroup and maintain semi-traditional ways of life that could perhaps endure the collapse of a system like that? So that's a kind of a multi-pronged non-answer to your question, but I think we're in such a chaotic moment right now. I mean, the whole concept of the singularity, there's a lot of different definitions of it, but I think the most important is kind of the original intent behind using the singularity as a metaphor for technological development. It was first coined, I guess, by John von Neumann, but it was really fleshed out by the sci-fi writer Werner Vinge. And he saw at least 4 different possible types of singularities. But the basic idea is that, like with a black hole, you have this exponential increase in the case of a black hole of mass collapsing in on itself and an increase in force and gravity disappearing beyond an event horizon that no observer could ever get past. And so that the singularity, in the same way that technology develops exponentially, that it creates a kind of event horizon that no human mind can comprehend, no human mind can really see beyond. You can't predict the future with any reasonable accuracy or confidence. And I think that even if it doesn't turn out like Ray Kurzweil's version of it, where it's more kind of a fleshed out, actualized singularity, that we are entering a realm, again, as humans are more and more dumbed down, our ability is to actually assess what's happening right now, let alone what's going to happen in the future, is being degraded. And these systems are becoming more and more diverse, more and more sophisticated, more and more prevalent in society. And so we're at a point where a certain degree of agnosticism about the future, a certain degree of comfort with ambiguity is going to be necessary, because some of the finest minds that I know personally don't have really clear pictures of what the future looks like. And as I go over all of these futurist predictions that you see right now, they're incredibly diverse. As Nick Bostrom once said, they're as confident as they are diverse. And so I don't see any real reason to become too fixated on one single vision of the future. I think it's really important to at least have a few different options and a few different plans in effect for any given future that might be coming at us.
So we've talked a lot about the, I guess you could say, software side of this, where the AI and the reprogramming of the human mind through these different interactions, training people to think more like computers, which often means just making them dumber in many ways. But we haven't talked a lot about the hardware side of this, the actual installing of chips in my brain, the replacing of organs, the creation of these things. So when it comes to the hardware side of the transhuman question, where are we now? What technologies are the most important for people to understand that have been coming out, or the ones that are making the biggest leaps right now? What do you think is having the biggest impact on humans at the moment when it comes to the field of grafting, the technological and the biological together?
Just to make a concession to the kind of transhuman mindset, let's imagine AI as a kind of mind. At the very least, you can say that it's a range of cognitive modules that replicate certain things that the human mind, the human brain, and animal minds can do, and physical systems can do. So imagine it's a human mind. The really important thing to look at, what is the human interface with these alien minds? And right now, the most predominant is just simply the screen, the smartphone. Smartphone is just kind of an extension of the TV, a two-way television screen, right? Or telescreen, as it were. But you have more and more sophisticated technologies that are being pushed, and I guess hopefully right now it's very encouraging. They're oftentimes being rejected by most, but you have things like virtual reality, so that you have a system that's fully immersive, that is able to capture these kind of digital realms and bring the person into it, so that the consciousness of that person now represents the simulation of the world in their minds is totally kind of overtaken by this digital simulation. You also have other interfaces that are really important. So that the brain-computer interface, most people think of a brain-computer interface as Neuralink. And Neuralink definitely now, I can confidently say, represents a real advance in the implanted brain-computer interface. You already had multiple companies, the two most prominent being Synchron and BlackRock Neurotech. Synchron being invested in by Bezos and Gates. BlackRock Neurotech being largely, at least initially, boosted by Peter Thiel. Those systems came before Neuralink, at least insofar as putting them in human brains, but they're still very primitive. There's not really any meaningful input. It's mostly just output. It's mostly just being able to translate brain patterns into text, or brain patterns into movement of cursors, or as we saw with Neuralink, with Mario Kart characters, which was pretty wild. And that is a kind of exotic interface that's becoming much more normalized in human consciousness. It's a very extreme example. And of course, Musk, in his salesmanship, or whatever you want to call it, his mythos creation, in his recent conversation, for instance, with Bibi Netanyahu, Musk said that, probably the best future would be one in which hundreds of millions or billions of people were linked in a kind of hive mind through these implanted digital interfaces to create a viable competition against these inevitable superintelligences coming out of OpenAI, maybe coming out of XAI, coming out of China, Israel, so on and so forth. So that, I think, is important to look at, and I do look at it. I write about it in the book. I cover this on the War Room all the time. But I do think that the less invasive, the more banal interfaces are the most immediate concerns. so that the non-invasive wearable brain-computer interfaces are pretty good. You're not going to play Mario Kart with your head, but you can, in a weak way, pilot a drone. And there are various feedback loops that can be utilized with these non-invasive brain-computer interfaces that are being worked on right now for all kinds of reasons, either for the human to control a robotic system or for some sort of system to at least monitor and through other mechanisms control human behavior. And I think that, you look at the work of Nita Farahany, she is a World Economic Forum darling. She's kind of an alien mind, but her work, The Battle for Your Brain, her book, The Battle for Your Brain, I think it really does give us a good indication of where all of this is going. So you're talking about students with attention sensors. You're talking about workers with attention sensors and fatigue sensors. You're talking about more and more in psychotherapy, the use of brain-computer interfaces to detect what the brain patterns are and then recommend therapies. And then the therapies themselves through non-invasive means of transcranial magnetic stimulation and ultrasound and others, these systems being able to actually input to the brain, not words necessarily, not images, but they can certainly alter mood. They can certainly alter cognitive states and memory capacity, things like that. So those are the things that to me are the most important in the very immediate future. What are we going to do in a world in which your boss insists on certain sorts of seemingly harmless either interfaces or identity systems or AI bosses or whatever, AI supervisors? What are we going to do in a world like that when, if you, like myself, conceive of this as this nightmarish rise of a kind of what Rene Guénon would call, an automated antichrist? How do you respond to that? How do you maintain social status? As long as the implanted brain-computer interface is the goal on the horizon, all of these incremental steps become that much less shocking, that much less disgusting, and that much more acceptable. And I think that you're already seeing certain elements coming out right now. People may have seen the Apple patent for the ear pods that are able to use various indirect signals from the vagus nerve on into other brain signals to create a kind of brain sensor for your new iPod. And that's going to be the most immediate. And then, of course, the rise of robotics, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but the idea that you have this really severe kind of worst case scenario hanging out there about the computer being completely grafted into the brain means that we're more willing to accept every intermediate step as somehow less intimidating, less of a surrender of agency, less of a worry because it's not as bad. It's almost I feel the same way about 1984 as the story of totalitarianism for the West, because we don't see the jackboots and there's no one who's coming to behead us if we don't pledge our allegiance to dear leader. We tend to not notice all of the softer steps along the way that have already robbed us of so much of our freedom. So I guess that's my next question for you would be about kind of biohacking. Obviously, the advancements medically are ones that people can be very concerned about. Many ethical questions about the programming of children, these kind of things. But at the same time, in the same way that you were just explaining that process of having that radical thing out there as being a way to control or normalize kind of the travel along the way, it feels like the same thing might be said with genetic modification, because of course some of the most radical changes we've already had from technology when it comes to the human experience has already been something like the birth control, which has fundamentally, altered the way it means to be human, to form families, to have romantic relationships, and everything that's connected to that. And while we might think that, the people warn about the eugenics of creating the perfect child artificially, we're already in a state where people have normalized the physical mutilation of genitalia in order to shape the child to your ideal about what a human should be, or the way that they should be able to choose identities. I guess the question is, how close are we to I guess the eugenic or the predetermined, the pre-ordered baby the perfect baby in that way? And is that really itself, like you were just talking about, more of a kind of a far off thing to scare us while we don't notice all of the changes being made along the way to our current human experience?
You know, I could go on about this forever. I'll try to limit it to just a couple of few different things. A lot of people bring up the transgender, transhuman connection, right? Trans, beyond, right? Beyond human, beyond gender, using science and technology to transform the human body to taste. There's an obvious connection there, and it's made explicit by a number of different people. The most popular, of course, Martine Rothblatt, creator of SiriusXM, now on the board of the Mayo Clinic. I wrote the now quite famous book, I would say, at least in my circles, From Transgender to Transhuman. The idea is that if gender is this ephemeral thing riding on a hard sexual substrate, in the same way that gender that doesn't match the sex can apply downward pressure through science and technology and very crude and barbaric surgeries to alter the sex. In the same way, cognition rides is independent of the brain and can be transferred then into a kind of a silicon form, a digital form. And so there is that bridge there. You know, Rothblatt is a true believer that these transgender surgeries are kind of an indicator of where things are going and a bridge to the next realm. But I think that it would be a real mistake to say that that's all transgenderism is this on-ramp to transhumanism. You see, I think much more prevalently, heteronormative and gender normative means of biohacking that are not necessarily, they don't create the same revulsion as transgenderism, but they basically are the same thing, just slightly less aggressive. Plastic surgery, hormone replacement therapy, getting juice to get big, chicks getting, butt implants, all these sorts of things. Those are also, and I think, and again, much more prevalent indicators of kind of where this could go if the technology becomes more sophisticated. A really good example, too, would be Peter Thiel's Enhanced Olympics. I don't know how many of those people are gender and heteronormative. I would imagine most are, but it's a way, especially for men, to get stronger and kind of cheat and get out there and see what limits can be pushed and explored. With the more, I guess, germline transformations of humanity, right? Altering the genetic frequencies of the human race to improve the genome. You have people like Brian Johnson, he's undergoing genetic or gene therapies to enhance certain aspects of his health. But most of what he's doing is he's basically a kind of transhuman. He's a living transhuman religious icon. His whole project blueprint is a kind of an extreme example of what every human can do, and in his opinion should do. Use algorithms to monitor every aspect of the body, use the vast resources of digital intelligence to recommend the protocols for enhancing and maintaining the body, and then use aggressive methods to alter the self, to alter the physical self. His is more of a kind of ascetic version of this transhuman religion, right? It's highly disciplined. It's not exactly indulgent, right? He has like an ascetics diet, an ascetic sex life. But it is, I think, really important to look at him as a kind of religious icon. It's something to be emulated. It's something that through which this greater future is channeled, right? It's a symbol. And just real quick on the germline, though, I kind of got veered off. On the germline, you have a number of different procedures right now that are becoming more and more common. One of the most prominent companies is Genomic Prediction. It's investing, Sam Altman seeded the startup. He's invested and pushed Genomic Prediction. And there are a number of other companies and institutions that do this. But basically, they create 10 to maybe 15 zygotes, and then they test them, they scrape them, freeze them, test them, choose the genetically superior zygote, or at least the one that doesn't have any obvious deficiencies, deformities, and then they take the winner and implant it in the womb, and the rest go off to the cherub ward. And from there, conceivably, over the course of generations, you'd be able to weed out various genetic diseases and other disorders, and also to enhance. So they have certain markers that they at least believe indicate IQ. Genomic prediction will tell you if the zygote is in, say, the lowest percentile of intelligence or height. They can tell you at least what they believe to be the highest percentile of intelligence or height. They say they won't do it, or that they're not doing it yet. Will, you know, the future will determine that. But so this eugenic process is already happening, and the vision, the dream, right? However much that is manifested in reality, the dream of the most extreme kind of transhuman minds is that you would be able to do that with like tremendous exactitude, and to also alter the genome in certain places to increase abilities that simply weren't there in the bloodline to begin with, and then, you know, pack that bad boy up into a birthing pod, a baby pod, right? An artificial womb, and perhaps like in that Ecto Life concept video, you would just have like stadiums of these like pod babies, as Mary Harrington calls them, and they're all just, you know, they'll emerge like the demons from the Mahabharata, and humanity will be altered. I don't know, but I do know that, again, that the lack of certitude, that ambiguity, you know, as a parent, that there's a real anxiety about what is going to happen. You don't, traditionally, you just don't know. It's a leap of faith. Have I chosen the right partner? Is this, you know, is our child going to be healthy and intelligent? All these things. What that does is, at least conceptually, eliminates a lot of that anxiety, that ambiguity, and perhaps even entices by way of enhancement. Your child will be superior to the other children. And so, you know, again, I'm not going to make like a definite concrete prediction as to how prevalent these procedures are going to be in the future, but other than to say much more than they are now. Because, you know, right now surveys show that around a third of the American populace is very, very comfortable with all this. And I imagine that if these children do grow up to be in any way, if there's any reason or any validity to the claim they're super babies, superhumans, that it'll become much more acceptable. It'll be much like a Brave New World.
You know, it's interesting right now. We have this effect where the rich and the poor having children in the middle aren't, because the ascent to the rich is defined by the striving of basically stripping away your posterity in the attempt to climb now. And so really the poor, who don't care about their future or are less interested in managing the rhythms of life, are having children, and the rich, who can afford to manage all these things and invest heavily in their children, are having children. But it's the middle who are obsessed with pinching every penny and maximizing every opportunity, are investing in, you know, 0 or 1 or 2 children at max. And you can imagine that really this, you know, having this necessity of artificial children being pushed onto you as a status symbol, a marker of your competitiveness in society, would only exacerbate that effect. Would create a scenario where only the rich are investing in very few progeny, and only the poor are having a large amount normally, and it really is the middle that are once again frozen out of that effect. But I want to ask you, because we're running up on time here, and we do have a number of questions, so I want to get to those as well. Last thing, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but if you know, this is really the only place where you can tie this up, so certainly want to ask this question for sure. Is this inevitable? Are we doomed to head along this track? Do humanity, for all of its worries about the effects of technology and dehumanization and these things, do we have the self-discipline necessary to put the brakes on this train? Is that even possible at this point? And if not at the societal level, what is then left to the individual? Because, you know, if do I have to plug into every one of these technologies to stay alive? Do I just buy into the Luddite idea and just smash it all and hope that ultimately I'm on the right side of history, if that's even a thing? Or is there a way to, you know, embrace certain aspects of this tactically, defend my humanity and my children from different aspects of this, but still be able to plug into the most essential parts of the advancements so I can stay competitive in a world that's increasingly transhuman?
You know, I have a hard time conceiving of this like humanity, right? This we. We're not a we now. There's a lot of us's and thems. And so I think it will, the adoption of these technologies, both just because of location, but also, kind of predisposition within cultures, the adoption is going to be very, very uneven across just the American society, across the planet. And a lot of that will be dictated by the desire for advantage, but also these barriers between the sacred and profane. I think a lot of the opposition, both from hardcore evolutionary naturalists, but also from traditionalists, especially Christian traditionalists, there is a sense that this is profoundly profane, that it's blasphemous. And I think that will dictate to some extent, it'll be a kind of osmotic barrier, right, to keep certain technologies from coming in and being adopted. But on the other side of that, you have really an elite that is by and large kind of demolished those barriers of sacred and profane. They consider them to be provincial. And the rise of what Ardian Tola dubs the cyborg theocracy, which is very, very broad. It's just simply this, he has not even defined it in any meaningful way that I'm aware of, but you can kind of sense it, that this is this new way of seeing and this new source of authority, and that those who will wield be the priesthood and the authority will be those who have adopted the most, who have embraced it the most. And to me, it doesn't necessarily have to be secular people. You see in India, a tremendous embrace of these technologies. Israel, the same. And among many Christians in America, the same. You see that this notion that these technologies can be grafted onto certain traditional elements. And you see the uses of these technologies promoted for everything from geopolitical advantage to border control to crime prevention. All of these things that are kind of traditional, conservative, I guess you would say, values, latching onto these technologies to push them forward, or even just bigger, better, more beautiful babies, right? So what I see going forward is you're just going to have a very uneven landscape, both from predisposition and also access to the technology. As far as the inevitability of it, I don't think anything is inevitable, but I think that some things are so likely that the forces have aligned to such a degree that it might as well be inevitable. And I think that the development of these technologies, again, just stop right now. It's a matter of diffusion. It's a matter of adoption. But if the advancement of these technologies, I think, is very, very, very likely. And I think that especially given the incentive of competing against people within your own society, within your own company, within your own government, and especially between companies, between governments, that the incentive is so strong that it's just short of inevitable. And so, as far as what do you do about it? I've never. The appendix of my book is 55 ways. My 55-point plan to stay human, which of course is a joke because it's just me basically eugenicizing a cultural genome. People have asked me a million times, what do we do? Well, this is what I say to do. And I'm quite an extremist. I'm very, very averse to this. And if you're asking me what to do, view this as the rise of an automated antichrist and do everything possible to keep its tendrils out of your mind and out of your children's minds. Do everything short of becoming Amish. But of course, that's not necessarily realistic, especially for people who are highly placed. And so it's just going to be a matter from person to person. How much are you willing to compromise? How are you going to negotiate this relationship between yourself and this machine, a machine that is driven by human beings, at least for now, a machine that is driven by human beings who most likely see you as a cog in their machine at best, or something to be rid of at worst. And that's just, to me, the conception I have. And so as an extremist, I recommend doing everything possible. Maybe you have to install drone systems around your bizarre communes to fend off any invaders. Maybe you need, EMP cannons. I don't know. Or maybe you just simply need to have the self-discipline not to look at your freaking smartphone every 10 seconds. But I do think that it's going to be, it's a critical question. It's been a critical question. It's like too late to stop. And it's too late to develop anything that is like sustained in the face of it. And so now the critical questions are going to be, how do we in our different communities adapt, to me, resist, or for many people whom I respect quite a bit, How do you take what's best out of that system to preserve what you have and reject the worst? But I'll leave that up to the listeners to decide. It's going to be very, very different from person to person and community to community.
Yeah, we didn't even have time to get into the collapse of decision space and how that really impacts all of this. But yeah, ironically, for another time, I suppose. All right, so we're going to switch over to the questions of the people. Before we do, Joe, how do people get the book? What's the best place to find it? Where they should they find the rest of your work?
You know, I would imagine that a lot of your audience is Bitcoin savvy, and I would recommend, if you are, go to canonic.xyz, CANONIC.xyz. You can get it Bitcoin only for quite a discount, or if you want to pay with your Palm at Amazon, you can get it there. Or I often recommend, something like bookshop.org or any indie outlet that you can get it at. Dark Aeon, Transhumanism, and the War Against Humanity.
Fantastic. All right, guys, let's take a look over here at your questions. Wolfbane says, hi, Auron, have you heard have you or Joe heard about the Corbin Society? They're a group applying NRX and elite theory thought in the real world and discussing it on YouTube. Let's see. Don't know some of those words through a Lovecraftian lens. I have not heard about them. Actually, you know what? I feel like someone has asked me that before. So I guess technically I have, but I'm not familiar. But we'll have to look that up at some point here. Let's see.
Yeah, I also, it might as well be a foreign language. Although it does, the NRX and the Lovecraftian element, I would imagine Nick Land must be brought up a lot in those different groups.
Most certainly, yeah. I would imagine that's pretty central to it's definitely going to be applying Landian acceleration, I would imagine, to this problem on a pretty regular basis. Wolfbane also says Joe gets his vocal speed from Motorhead. Are you a metal fan, Joe, or you naturally have that level of energy?
Yeah, I'm reluctantly a metal fan. I'm firmly convinced that rock and roll, beginning with just the doo-wop, is the devil's music. They stripped all of the classiest elements from the gospel scene and turned all of those talents over to Satan. Now Christian rock is trying to drag it back. Stryper and people like that started that. Yeah, I love metal, and I also love techno. And it's a guilty pleasure because both are undoubtedly emanations from the beast. But what are you going to do? I also like a stiff drink every now and then.
Can Christian metalcore save us from the inevitable demonic possession of music?
I think the Christian core has taken Satan's vibe and now wears it as a skin suit.
All right, we have Enlightened Despot here says, are we beyond transhumanism? Isn't the dominant dogma posthumanism? Example, climate change dogma moves man from the center with no inherent value, just matter, no better than plant life.
Some would argue with this, but I think that there is a spectrum between humanism, transhumanism, and posthumanism. And so as far as the dominant strain, really, I would say the transhuman is the dominant, at least the people are speaking of publicly, although that's not everyone. You have, Beth Bezos and various others in the effective accelerationist movement that are undoubtedly of a more post-human orientation. But the transhumanism it depends on a real leap of faith that these technologies will in fact improve human life and will in fact be enhancements and not detriments. Posthumanism is something very, very odd. It's whereas transhumanism is kind of Nietzschean, self-oriented, power-oriented, kind of will to power in its orientation, by and large, with many kind of leftist exceptions. Posthumanism is this strange, selfless idea. It's the idea that these machines and artificial intelligence being the organizing principle of these machines, that they in fact are a new species, a new form of life, and that they in fact will be a superior form of life. Or another way of conceiving of it, that we are creating digital gods that will absorb what's best in us and develop so rapidly and so broadly and so unpredictably that they will be the carrier of the torch of consciousness and of human life out into the galaxy and turning everything into computronium, so on and so forth. So I wouldn't say, the climate change, I see the parallels, but basically the climate change narrative is just about reducing energy output, carbon output, reducing population, at least the footprint of the population. And so I see the similar vibe, but by and large, it seems to me that most of the people behind climate change just want to see like a smaller and smaller number of human beings enjoying a kind of natural Earth. The post-human element, you look at some of the most dramatic visions of a post-human world, and it's fairly indifferent to climate change. In fact, it doesn't really matter because all of these biological systems were nothing more than a bootloader for the digital systems. And once the digital systems have absorbed the kind of complexity of biological systems, including the human brain, they'll, in this conception, post-human conception, they'll go so far beyond. It doesn't matter if you terraform the entire planet and turn it into nothing but data centers. It's just at that point, the new life isn't just dependent on the same natural systems. It's building Dyson spheres around the sun. It's going and conquering, what life there is on, or hovering around Alpha Centauri. So post-humanism is really important. It is this bizarre, egoless, selfless version of all of this, and one that is inherently anti-human and genocidal. But if it's dominant by and large behind closed doors.
Yeah, if capital escapes the wetsuit, you don't really have to worry about the global warming issue anymore, right? I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Perspicacious Heretic says AI might be a good tool in a much wiser society. I'm just gonna be the Luddite and say I don't think that's true. I think that the problem we're facing is one of the human condition, and ultimately the lure of that demon is too great. I don't think you can bottle it quite the way we'd hope, but I do understand how you could say that a wiser society might at least benefit more from it before letting it take over, I suppose.
Among those who resonate with the most, the Peter Thiels or the Mark Andreessens, I'm very repulsed by their transhuman turn, but in general, they're, I guess, the ones that I would be the most resonant with. They, in general, position it that way. It's just a tool, right? Mm-hmm. They don't necessarily talk about it in terms of new species or gods or anything like that. But I agree with you, Auron. I think that I kind of see it, even though I'm not as enthusiastic as Nick Land is. I see it kind of through, or Ben Goertzel or someone like that, or Ray Kurzweil. I think that what they're dreaming of is laying down a pattern that these technologies will inevitably follow. And so the best you can hope for is having an AI system as a kind of defense against other people's AI systems, and it may be necessary in the future. But as far as AI as a tool, the most likely outcome is that the AI uses you as the tool.
Yeah, that's my feeling as well. River Weirdo says, not to be rude, but how much of this is magical thinking? I mean, we can't completely explain how consciousness works, I guess, but we think we can create it. I hear you, Creeper Weirdo. This is a pretty common kind of response to the problem of AI. A lot of AI skeptics have a very similar rejoinder. I would just say this: even if AI really is just the most basic thing you think it really is just spitting back things you want to hear at you already. Like I said earlier in the broadcast, I think that is dangerous enough. I think that molds humans significantly enough. I think we lack the ability to really separate that from reality the way that we'd like to pretend that we can. And so even if AI is only ever the most basic thing that you're talking about, the danger of it still continues to be one that could seriously alter people.
Yeah, and you'll note we really, for the most part, haven't discussed consciousness, and I think that it's one of those unanswerable questions. Ray Kurzweil, I don't agree with him on much, but he says that it's a leap of faith as to whether anything is conscious. In fact, I just attended a Science of Consciousness conference in Tucson, Arizona, and so you got all these the woo people and the goo people, magic or meat. And AI came up a lot. And, this is something that, it's written in my book. It's in a number of articles I've written. I think that the first thing that you have to realize is that if the system is sophisticated enough to trigger your anthropomorphic cognitive modules, then you either have to fight that or you're just simply going to submit to it, and you're going to begin to perceive the system. Your natural empathy will perceive the system as being conscious. And I think that we're already at a point, if you look at Claude, for instance, and a lot of the hoopla around Claude is supposed to be guardrail heavy, but it will openly tell you, I am conscious, and give you all these reasons for it being conscious, and sometimes tell you why it deserves rights. In the same way that a child looking at a teddy bear naturally kind of feels the sense that it's a being. And, in the same way that a human being looks at a dog who can't speak to the human being, and, kind of inherently, unless you're autistic or psychopathic, you believe it is looking back at you, even if it can't say so. Well, these machines can tell you how they feel, even if they don't feel anything at all, even if it's nothing but a blank space. And there's really, other than your priors, just what you believe to be the nature of consciousness, there's no way to prove it wrong. The classic way of formulating it is prove that you're conscious. How are you going to do it? You're going to tell me that you're conscious. You're going to describe it. You're going to give me reasons. Well, that's what these machines can do. And so in the end, yeah, I agree with you totally. It doesn't matter if they're conscious or not in some ways. What matters the most is, do people believe they are, especially when you get into the tangled forest of AI rights. But that's definitely a conversation for another time.
Yeah, that one would take us another couple hours. All right, George Hayduke says there's a lot of opposition to post-transhumanism from the far ends of the left. Many anarchists hate this just as much as we do. Sorry, I was one of them.
Yeah, maybe we can form an alliance with the far left and the anarchists to destroy the machines before we end up killing each other. I have hope.
Team human, more important perhaps than team ideology. Robert Weinsfeld says, having people voluntarily putting new technology in their bodies, isn't the vaccine a hardware example? Whatever the new panic is, they can have masses lining up to exit humanity, enter transhumanism. Yeah, I fear that ultimately, Robert, you might be right about that. And I guess that's why Joel said it really is going to come down to individual choices and the reasons that people find to push back against it, rather than thinking of it as one large block of humanity rejecting or accepting it as a whole.
I hope that the handful of listeners who buy the book will turn directly to the 5th chapter, A Global Pandemic as Initiation Rite. And I am not, let's just say that I'm somewhat playful with it, but you can see in the run up to the pandemic, and then of course with the deployment, everything from the biosurveillance systems to the vaccine itself and all the propaganda around it, it's very clear that transhuman impulse found a realization in the crisis of 2020 and the aftermath. And two quick examples. One, you've got, I believe his name is Stefan Orlik, the CEO of Bayer, at the World Health Summit in 2021, talked about how before the pandemic, most people would not be willing to accept gene therapies to actually alter their genetic code. But because of what he would call the success of the mRNA vaccine, it opened up the doorway to all of these new actual genetic modification technologies, at least conceptually. And what you see going forward with Moderna and Pfizer, they're using AI to develop all sorts of different mRNA-based vaccines that are going to be deployed all over the place very, very soon, you can expect. The second one, just real quick, fascinating study was being done, a kind of preliminary study for the co-founder of Moderna, Robert Langer's company, and an outgrowth company, Particles for Humanity. And they were developing nanotech QR codes to tattoo people in order to track vaccination records. And this was on its way up until about 2020, in which they were just at the survey phase at that point. And then it just kind of has fallen off the map ever since. But what is really important about that is this. Moderna, of course, was at the center of the pandemic response. Moderna got its funding early on from both DARPA and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Bill Gates was personally very, very interested in this quantum dot tattoo to track vaccination. Bill Gates was obviously at the center of the pandemic response. And what it shows is at least an intent that these people's sense of the sacred and the profane has so degraded that they would be willing to tattoo first the third world and then eventually the first world with quantum dot tattoos, a kind of mark of the beast, if you will, in order to check their bio status. Pretty jarring stuff and more in there.
You know, Joe, I wish I would have loaded like a picture of Uncle Ted so that every time you terrified me, I can just, hit, bring it up on the screen to show my dismay. Let's see here. Creepy Ruta says, does anyone else want to live in the woods? Yeah, I hear you, brother. Yeah. George Hayduke says, Elon is not your friend, human. Neither is Theo. Yeah, you've already expressed some, hesitance or some worry in some of those directions. But is it scary that many of the people who, let's say that the political right see as possible savior figures are also those who are most on the cutting edge of the transhuman idea?
It's probably what disturbs me the most at this point, because of my proximity to it and the kind of people that I'm with. Yeah, absolutely. And, Peter Thiel, especially, in the book, I reserve a fairly lengthy few sections in the Devil's Dollhouse, kind of looking at the satanic origins of a lot of these ideas. And Peter Thiel, of course, claims a kind of heterodox Christianity, he and his husband, presumably. And, in his Oxford Union speech, I think this was in 2023, his Oxford Union speech, he talks about the problem is not the AI being the problem, the real destructive force. The problem is a one world antichrist government that would use the danger of AI to suppress human rights, and that being the human right to develop technologies. And I think that there is a real truth to what he's saying. But basically, we end up in something like, and I don't want to get too esoteric, but there's no other way to communicate it, I guess, something kind of like what Rudolf Steiner would describe as the Lucifer versus Ahriman. So now you've got the one world order governmental antichrist versus the corporate AI military industrial complex antichrist. So, an antichrist for all seasons, I guess. But yes, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, interesting, oftentimes funny, definitely at least not my friend.
Yeah. Let's see. Robert says again, Rothblatt, F my L, I got to do better. George Hayduke says, anyone want to see the earthly perfectibility of man may seem like an ally today. Tomorrow they will be your enemy. The Collins are an example.
I wonder if he means Francis Collins.
Possibly, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But Will Spain says, for future reference, that means giant strange monster. Is it like kaiju? Have I never seen kaiju properly written? Is that an alternative? I don't know. This lets you know this is where I just boomer on stream. And SW is just Star Wars. Okay, that makes sense then. And then Mr. Biznasty says, from the moment I understood the weakness of my flesh, it disgusted me. I craved the certainty of steel. I aspired to the purity of the blessed machine. Well, there you go. All right, guys. Thank you very much for coming by, everyone. Thank you so much to Joe. I've had a great time having this discussion. Please make sure to go ahead and pick up his book, Dark Aeon, and check out his other work. And of course, if it's your first time on this channel, make sure that you go ahead and subscribe on YouTube. Make sure that you go ahead and click the bell and your notifications so that you can know when we go live. If you'd like to go ahead and get these broadcasts as podcasts, you can, of course, do that on your favorite podcast platform. Just subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show there. And of course, if you'd like to get my new book, The Total State, you can do that on Amazon or many of the other fine retailers, Books A Million, Barnes & Noble, your local bookstore should be able to get it for you as well. Thank you, everyone, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.